Now that we understand validity, we can use the notion of validity in reconstructing arguments. Now, the point of reconstructing an argument is to put it in a shape that makes it easier for us to assess the argument more accurately and fairly for whether it's a good argument or a bad argument. And when we do the reconstruction, remember, we want to make it as good an argument as possible, because you don't learn anything from putting down your enemies by making them look silly, right? If you want to learn from somebody else's argument, you need to put it in the best shape you can to make it look as good as possible. So that's going to be the goal of reconstruction. And we're going to accomplish that goal in a series of stages. The first stage is simply to do a close analysis, and we talked about that last week. The second stage is to get down to basics. That is to remove all the excess words and focus on the premises and conclusion that really make up the argument, and then put those into standard form. The third stage is to clarify those premises. They're not always going to be as clear as you like, and that's going to take some work, and it's going to include breaking them into parts. And then the next stage is to take those parts and organize them, to put them in order so you can see how the argument flows from one part to another. But not all arguments are complete, so the next stage we have to fill in the gaps, that is, supply suppressed premises. And once we've done that, then the final stage is going to be to assess the argument. If we are able to come up with a sound reconstruction, we know that the conclusion has to be true because, as we learned in the previous lecture, the conclusion of sound arguments is always true. But if we don't come up with a sound reconstruction, then we've got to decide, is it the fault of the argument or is it our own fault because we didn't come up with a sound reconstruction when there really is one that we didn't find? So that's going to be something we have to discuss. We're going to discuss all of these stages over the next few lectures. Now, the first stage of reconstruction is to do a close analysis. But we already learned how to do that. That was easy. Boy, hope the rest of them are that easy. This lecture is mainly going to be about the second stage, namely getting down to basics. And what we want to do is to pull out the explicit premise and conclusion from all the other words around it. And the first step is to remove all the excess verbiage. You know, it might seem really surprising, but people often repeat themselves. I'm sure you've all run into it. I mean, you listen to somebody give a talk, and it takes them 50 minutes to say what they could have said easily in 5 minutes. And one of the reasons is that they say everything 10 times. You know, for instance, people often say the same thing twice. They repeat themselves. They say the same thing over again, and they restate the point in different words. And they utter sentences that mean the same thing, and they say something and then they say it again, and they make a claim twice or more. They assert exactly what they just said, and they reformulate their claim in different words that are equivalent. They say it once, and then they say it again. You get the idea. Now, here's a real example from a U.S. politician during a debate. I want to be honest with people. We can't eliminate this deficit. People have heard that over and over again in 4 years. We cannot do it. We're in too deep a hole. Now, if you think about it, it's going to be obvious that we cannot do it repeats, we can't eliminate this deficit, because that's what doing it is, eliminating the deficit. But also, we're in too deep a hole. Well, that's just a metaphorical way of saying the same thing. Why is the hole too deep? Because we can't get out of it. What hole is it? It's the deficit hole. So to say we can't get out of this hole, we're in too deep a hole, is just another way of saying we can't eliminate the deficit. So in these 3 lines, he's already repeated himself 3 times. Now, why does this politician repeat himself? It might be that he thinks people will remember it better, or one version will make more sense than another. But he might have a special reason, because this was a live debate, and he had to give a 90-second answer. And so he had to fill up the time. Sometimes people repeat themselves just to fill up the time, or maybe to give himself time to think, because he didn't have a real answer ready yet, and repeating himself is easy while he thinks about what he's really going to say in the next few sentences. Fine, but repeating it still doesn't make the argument any better. And we want to get down to the basics of the argument, that is, the parts of the argument that really affect how good it is. So we can cross out those repetitions that don't make the argument any better. So first, we can cross out, we cannot do it. Then we can cross out, we're in too deep a hole. We already saw that those are just repeating the claim that we can't eliminate the deficit. In addition, we can cross out, I want to be honest with people, because that's not a reason to believe that we're in too deep a deficit. And next, we can cross out that people have heard that over and over again in 4 years. Well, that might be seen as a reason to believe that we're in a deficit because everybody seems to say it. But let's assume that that's not part of his argument here, and we'll cross it out. Now let's move on. A second form of excess verbiage, that is, words that don't contribute to the force of the argument, is what I like to call road markers. A lot of times people, good speakers, they tell you what topic they're talking about and why they're talking about it, why it's important and worth talking about. But to say why it's an important issue and to say what issue it is doesn't provide any reason to believe that what they say about the issue is true or false. So it doesn't contribute to the argument. Here's an example from the same politician in the same debate as we just saw. This politician said, now I want to go back to the whole issue of health care because we touched it. And I think the American people deserve to know what we would do different. Now notice that he says he's going to talk about health care, but he doesn't say anything about health care. He doesn't tell you what he's going to say about health care. All he says is he wants to go back to that issue, and he tells you why he wants to go back to that issue. But he doesn't add any reason to believe that what he's about to say about the issue is true. Now this can of course still be useful because you might get confused about what the issue is, and he might be changing the topic, and he wants to signal that he is changing the topic, and that'll help his listeners. But it still doesn't add to the argument. It doesn't give you any reason for the conclusion that he's going to want to draw. We can cross out these excess words. We can cross out, now I want to go back to the whole issue of health care, because that doesn't show that his views on health care are correct. And we can cross out, because we touched it, that's a reason why we're going to that issue, but again, that doesn't give any reason why his views are correct. And we can even cross out, but I think the American people deserve to know what we would do different, because the fact that they deserve to know what you're going to do doesn't show that what you're going to do is the right thing to do. So none of these claims are really reasons. They're going to be reasons for the main part of his argument, which is to support the particular views on health care that he's going to tell you about a few seconds after this. The next type of excess verbiage is tangents. People go off on tangents all the time. Here's an example. You really ought to think about taking a history course. I still remember my history courses in college. There was this one time when there was a dog that one of the students brought to class, and the dog barked, and then he ran up on stage and he cut under the professor and knocked the professor on his rear end. It was really funny. So, I think that history is a good thing to study. Now notice that all this stuff about the dog has nothing to do with history. It's no reason to take a history course instead of a philosophy course or a classics course or a science course. The same thing could happen in those courses just as well. So the tangent plays a certain role. It makes it interesting, it keeps your attention, maybe it makes it memorable for you what he said, but it doesn't actually provide a reason why you ought to take a history course. So, since those parts of the words were just a tangent that don't provide any reason, we can cross them out too, because they are excess verbiage. But sometimes people go off on irrelevant tangents, not just by accident because they lose their train of thought, but because they're trying to fool you. They're trying to produce what's called a red herring. The name red herring supposedly comes from somebody who crossed the red herring over the trail, and then the hounds couldn't track his scent anymore. And that's basically what's going on here. Sometimes people produce tangents that distract you from the main line of argument, because they know that there are weaknesses in that line of argument and they don't want you to notice them. That's what a red herring is. And it's a type of tangent that you have to learn to watch out for, because if you want to see the problems in your opponent's arguments or even in your friend's arguments, then you need to not get distracted by tangents that are in effect red herrings. Yet another example of excess verbiage is, well, examples. Here's an example of that. A different politician in the same debate said this: here's what happened. In the time that they have been in office, in the last 4 years, 1.6 million private sector jobs have been lost. 2.7 million manufacturing jobs have been lost. And it's had real consequences in places like Cleveland. Cleveland is a wonderful, distinguished city that's done a lot of great things, but it has the highest poverty rate in the country. 1 out of almost 2 children in Cleveland are now living in poverty. Now notice that this politician is talking about the unemployment rate in the rest of the country, in the country as a whole. So why bring in Cleveland? Well, he might be saying that Cleveland shows that there's problems throughout the rest of the country, but that can't be right because Cleveland's just one example, and it might be an outlier that doesn't represent the general trends. So what he's really doing with this example is he's trying to bring it down to home and make you feel for the real effects. But he doesn't come out and say that you can generalize from Cleveland to the rest of the country or that everyone else is suffering in exactly the same way. He's just giving one example. And so it doesn't really support his general claim that the unemployment is a problem throughout the whole country. That means that it's not an extra premise in the argument, and we can cross it out like other forms of excess verbiage. Now we've seen that excess verbiage can take the form of repetition, or road markers, or tangents, or examples. And people use these a lot. Matter of fact, I like to think of a general trick that people use called the trick of excess verbiage. A lot of people talk too much, and they keep saying things over and over again, go off on tangents, and give more examples than they really need. And all of that is a way of hiding the problem with their position. It's a trick to use too many words because the real point gets lost in the middle of those words. So you can fool people by throwing in those extra words. That's the trick of excess verbiage. But be careful. What seems like excess verbiage that's just there to trick you might really be an essential part of the argument. So what you need to do when you have a passage and you're trying to get the argument out of it is to cross out all the excess words, but also look at what's left over. If what's left over is enough premises and conclusion to make a good argument, then the stuff that you crossed out probably really is excess. But if it turns out that what's left over is not a very good argument, then you ought to check all those words you crossed out and make sure they really weren't necessary, because you're not being fair to the person that you're interpreting if you crossed out something that was an essential part of the argument. And some cases are going to be tricky. It's not going to be clear whether or not to cross them out. Some small words that are tricky are guarding terms. Here's an example. I think Miranda's at home, so we can meet her there. What's the guarding word? You already found that out when you did the close analysis, right? I think. Now, one way to read this argument is that the premise is, I think Miranda is at home, and the conclusion is, we can meet her there. But that's kind of weird, because the fact that you think she's at home is not what makes it true that you can meet her there. It's the fact that she is at home that can make it the case that you can meet her there. So if the premise is about what you think and the conclusion is about where she is and where you can meet her, then the argument doesn't make any sense. So in this case, what we want to do is to cross out the words I think, because that's going to make the argument look silly, and the argument really amounts to Miranda is at home, so we can meet her there. And the I think covers that whole thing. It's saying, I think she's at home, so I think we can meet her there. But the argument doesn't involve some premise about what your thoughts are. And contrast this with a different argument. Miranda's at home, so we can probably meet her there. Now there's another guarding term, right? Probably. Can you get rid of that? Well, then the argument becomes, Miranda's at home, so we can meet her there. But that's clearly not what the speaker was trying to say if they included the word probably. They realize that the fact that she's at home right now doesn't mean that we can meet her there, because it might take us a while to get there and she might leave while we're on the way. So it's not fair to the person giving the argument, and it makes the argument look worse to cross out the word probably. So in that case, you want to keep the guarding term in order to properly represent the force of the argument. So it looks like sometimes you need to keep the guarding terms, and sometimes you need to cross them out. And there's not going to be any strict rule that you can follow. You have to use your sense of what's going to make the argument as good as possible, what's going to fit what the speaker was really trying to say. Another tricky case is assuring terms. Suppose I'm writing a letter of recommendation and I say, he is clearly a great worker. I know that, so you ought to hire him. The assuring terms are clearly and I know that. But now the question is the argument really, first premise, he's clearly a great worker. Second premise, I know that. Conclusion, you ought to hire him. It's kind of weird, again, if you think about it. Because you're not hiring him because it's clear. If he's a great worker, but it's not clear that he's a great worker, then you still ought to hire him because he is a great worker. Or if he's a great worker and I don't know he's a great worker, you still ought to hire him because he's a great worker. The fact that I know it is irrelevant to whether you ought to hire him, because that's about my mental states, not his abilities. So that representation of the argument doesn't really capture the force of somebody who writes this letter of recommendation. So we can cross out the words, I know that, and we can cross out clearly, and then the argument is, he's a great worker, so you ought to hire him. But contrast this example. I am certain that Jacob is cheating on his wife, so I ought to tell her. Now you might think, I am certain that is just another assuring term, so we can cross it out. And then the real argument is Jacob is cheating on his wife, so I ought to tell her. But now think about that argument. The mere fact that he's cheating on his wife doesn't mean I ought to tell her if I'm not certain. Because if I have some suspicions or I'm just guessing, but I really don't know, then I probably ought not to tell Jacob's wife that Jacob is cheating on her. So here, the force of the argument does seem to depend on my certainty. If I'm not certain, I shouldn't tell her. If I am certain, maybe I should. So we can't cross out the assuring term in this case because that would distort the argument. Now, of course, some people might disagree with that. They might say, well, look, if you have some reason but you're not certain, then you ought to tell her. And that can be controversial. But we're talking here not about what those people think, but what the speaker thinks. The person giving this argument, when this person said, I'm certain that Jacob is cheating on his wife, they seem to indicate that to them, the fact that they're certain provides an even better reason why he should tell Jacob's wife. So if we want to capture what the person giving the argument intended, in this case, we have to leave in the assuring term. So we've seen one example where you ought to get rid of the assuring terms, and another example where you ought to keep the assuring terms. And just like with guarding terms, the same point applies. There's no mechanical rule that'll apply to every case. You have to think through the argument and decide whether crossing out those words and removing them distorts the argument, or instead, crossing them out makes the argument look even better. Because the point of removing excess verbiage is to get rid of the things that aren't necessary, but keep everything that is necessary to make the argument look as good as it possibly can look. Finally, once we've removed all the excess verbiage, what's left over? The answer is the explicit premises and conclusion in the argument. The point of removing the excess verbiage was to separate those essential parts of the argument, those basics of the argument, from all the stuff that's unnecessary. Of course, we still have to decide which ones are premises and which one's the conclusion, right? And that's why the close analysis helps, because we indicated which ones were reason markers and which ones were conclusion markers, and that lets you identify that these are the premises and that's the conclusion. And so now we can do step 3. We can put the argument in standard form. We put the premises above the line, and we put a dot pyramid and then the conclusion below the line, and we've got the argument in standard form, which completes stage 2 of the reconstruction project. At this point, it's useful to look back at the passage and see whether you've gotten rid of all the excess and included all of the basics of the argument. So you can look at the passage and say, is everything that's not crossed out in a premise or a conclusion of the standard form? And if there's something that's still there in the passage that isn't used, you've got to decide at that point, is it really excess or not? And of course, if the argument looks really bad, you've got to look back and see whether it's missing something that you had crossed out as being excess verbiage when it really was an essential part of the argument. So we can use this process of putting it into standard form as a test of whether we've performed properly the other step of getting rid of excess verbiage. So steps 2 and 3 really work together in this stage 2 of getting down to basics. That's what helps us to use the different parts to see whether we've done each of them properly.